Welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday. We're the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
And I'm John Kennedy.
So today we have a miraculous catch and a miraculous call. It is the fifth Sunday of Epiphany, and the passage is Luke 5, verses 1 to 11. Once while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw two boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long, but we have caught nothing. Yet, if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." And when they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. Okay, so here we go. This is a very familiar passage to all of us. There's versions of this, call stories of Peter, but here's the call is really to Peter, James, and John, though Peter is the star of the call story here. And we have another miraculous catch, obviously, at the end of John's gospel. And we also, in Luke, we have a different sense of the how they followed. In Mark, we get immediately they followed with no idea that they may have ever met before, and the same thing really in Matthew too. So we get a little bit of a longer. This takes place a little bit farther into the story in Luke's gospel. So what do you make of this?
And also just to add, John's call story is so, long and drawn out, and Jesus has this whole philosophical story with Nathanael, having seen him on the fig tree, and he's kind of like, just come and see, check it out. And it's a whole different vibe.
Yeah, very, very different. Yeah, and in John, it's on a different shoreline, right? It's on the shore of the Jordan.
Right. Yeah, so this is cool.
Yeah, I mean, Luke's ordering of this episode, which, as we said, appears in Matthew and Mark, is quite different. In Mark chapter 1, verse 16, just 16 verses into the gospel, we get this. This is before Jesus does anything. He's baptized, he is tempted, and then he gets going with this proclamation that the kingdom is at hand and calls the first disciples. And they leave, Mark tells us, and Matthew along with Mark tells us, that they leave their nets and their fathers, whereas Luke says they leave everything, but we'll come back to that, I'm sure. But just to say that Luke puts this after a fair amount of action has taken place. Since our last, since where we left off in Luke, because we've gone back in time for the presentation, going back to when Jesus is a baby in chapter 2. So picking up from where we left off in the story, we last looked at Jesus preaching in the synagogue in Nazareth. And what we skip between that passage and today's passage is the rejection of Jesus in his hometown, and then 4 activities connected with the Capernaum area. His first miracle in Luke is an exorcism, and then he heals Simon's mother-in-law before Simon is a disciple, and then preaches in the synagogues in the area. And then he calls these disciples, and that, along with the miraculous catch, which I know we'll talk more about, in Luke's narrative, helps make a bit more sense of why these guys would drop everything to follow him. They've actually seen him in action.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I think when I first looked at this as a boy, I thought I was really taken with the immediacy of it all. I mean, that was the story I got. But here you get you get a much more, okay, so this is how these are guys in the story, are reacting to Jesus. They know Jesus more. But we, as you pointed out earlier, we hardly ever hear about a call of Peter and Andrew on the shores of the Jordan. But, if you bring that in, and the fact that he's, healed his mother-in-law, so you go, okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's probably worth saying too that it's the first call in Luke, because at the end they got to be called all over again. They've sort of left Jesus hanging, so to speak, literally, and they do it again, and Jesus calls them, but throughout the gospel they can't really understand the message, and that's true in all of the gospels. But so I like that. He brings them all along, and I think that's a theme in Luke, is that everybody's traveling along with Jesus, and they don't really have the ears to hear or eyes to see. And interestingly, in this Sunday, though, the whole lectionary has that theme of the one called who really thinks that they're not capable of going. And in Isaiah 6, we have Isaiah saying, "But I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live with unclean lips people." And then Paul tells his story in Corinthians that he's the least of the apostles, not worthy to be called an apostle, and he had been persecuting the church of God. And here we have Peter, "Go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." So it seems like a real theme this Sunday that the disciple, if there's an epiphany here, it's that the disciple or potential disciple has a self-revelation that they really don't bring anything to the table, but Jesus sees that he can work through them, he can do the work with them.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think that's the most exciting part of the passage.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I ever. Yes, the self-revelation is in contrast to the revelation of the divine holiness. And you named some of them. I mean, we could also throw in Moses at the burning bush here too.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
But Rudolf Otto wrote that great book, The Idea of the Holy Theologian, looking at the experience of holy, and both the attraction to it and the fear that comes with it. And I think that what I experience in this, and I've read a little bit about this, is something I've been interested in, is that when Peter's reaction is both the same as Isaiah and also different than Isaiah in many ways, and that it's not an expression, it's not a moral expression, I'm a sinner sort of thing, like I've done a lot of stuff wrong. This is what happens when a human being comes in touch with the divine being, and you realize you're of a completely different class of being, and this is shock and awe, and the feeling of smallness and inadequacy in every way when one feels the presence of the divine being, and then that's what he's really responding to, and that interestingly, like you said. In Isaiah, his lips get burned so that he can talk. But here, there's no burning of lips. I mean, Jesus says to him, "Don't be afraid." There's a slightly different response.
Yes, it's really a precursor. Sorry, John, jump in here, but it's a foreshadowing of the resurrection appearances too, because Jesus,
that's good. I hadn't thought of that. I like that.
They're all cowering in fear, and he appears to them, and he has to say, "Do not be afraid." And they have a similar probably a similar reaction that we have failed you, and here you are to forgive us. So I think there's a real, kind of setting up of the big story here in this passage.
Yeah, I mean, I think the entire gospel, all four of them are written in the light of the resurrection, and it informs the remembering and telling of all these steps along the way. And going back to something you said, Peter, at the very beginning, that the miraculous catch piece of this story is very similar to the miraculous catch in John, which is, of course, a resurrection story in John. After Jesus has been raised, he appears on the shore while the disciples are out fishing. They've sort of just gone back to their life. Their Messiah is gone, as far as they know. Or they know, anyway, the sequencing and what the disciples know is kind of funny in John and beside the point right now. But anyway, they're back to their fisherman life, and Jesus does basically the same thing. They're not catching anything, using their own skill and knowledge and whatever. And Jesus says, put your net over there, and the same thing happens. They catch more than they can handle, more than the net can take. And so scholars have thought about, not just scholars, anybody who reads the Bible attentively and faithfully and has noticed this would think about, are these two different stories? Is this one story that John puts here and Luke puts here? And if so, like, what's sort of the more original? What story started being told and was circulating earlier? And there's some indications in Luke's text here that perhaps the resurrection placement of this story is the earlier one, because there's sort of traces of a resurrection faith and perspective in the telling. And one is that Simon calls Jesus Lord. Now, Jesus is addressed as Lord throughout the Gospel, so kind of make of that what you will, but it is a title that seems to be properly attached to Jesus post-resurrection. And like I said, all of the Gospels are told in light of the resurrection. But another piece is this, Lord, I am a sinful man, which depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, because it both, in a separate way, aligns perfectly with these Old Testament call stories of Moses at the burning bush, Gideon, who's called while beating wheat, Isaiah, who's called in the temple. All of them are, in one way or another, afraid and feel unworthy and small before the divine, as you have said. Moses hides his face. Gideon says, help me, Lord, for I have seen the angel of the Lord. Isaiah says, woe is me. So it fits in that way. But in another way, we could see perhaps traces of Peter's denial of Jesus, that he feels he's a sinful man because he has denied Jesus. Of course, this hasn't happened yet, but the story is told after that. So very interesting. I have more to say on the connections between Luke and John that I haven't really thought about before, but maybe that's enough for now.
Yeah. Well, you've brought a lot to this, and I really appreciate that as the scholarly conversation about, is this one story in two manifestations, or is this two different stories, or how it all fits together. I think the thing that, and it's way beyond my pay grade to know the answer to that, but I think there's one action that's central to it, and that is that anytime we are touched by the divine being, we feel small and inadequate, and that the holiness of God is a other category, and that I think that that's the thing that changes people's lives. I mean, Jesus changes people's lives. That's what's happening here. And he changes people's lives because of his holiness and his teaching. And don't forget that in antiquity, people picked their rabbis, but Jesus goes out and picks these people, but they follow because of his holiness. And I think that the failure of churches, I'm launching way forward here, nowadays in our world, is that we have maybe we haven't taught Jesus his way properly, but we haven't put people in touch with the divine being, the holiness of God, which is the thing that is the life-changing element of things. And I believe that when we die, we will have these sorts of experiences of the naked holiness of God, and that the church and the ministry and all this is to be a precursor of that. And what happens in this call story is that Peter gets a full-on whammo precursor of it, where he sees the holiness, and it's the holiness of Jesus, the being of Jesus, that changes him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right on. I also think that this theme we've been discussing about the people called realizing they're not worthy or feeling afraid or whatever is a lesson for everyone in the church too, that, often churches think we have to be personality driven and have some kind of brand. And, we do need to do those things on a practical level, but in general, we don't put the divine in front of people. We get out of the way, right. And I feel like that's very hard for our ego-driven society to just make space and,
beautiful.
And guard space for people to enter in and have their own encounter. And I think that's the secret sauce of Jesus drawing his disciples, is they're people who get out of their own way, and they realize they're absolutely bereft of content. It's God who has to do the work through them. And, obviously God uses our skill sets and stuff, but the humility of just, this is not about me, this is about the divine mystery. And I make space for that for other people.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, beautifully said. I mean, that's part of what drew me to our liturgical tradition, that it makes space at its best when it's handled properly. It makes space for people to encounter God without it being all about the brand or the personality of whoever's running the show, which obviously is kind of the case in a lot of other ways of worshiping and doing church, certainly in our culture. There's it's sort of an inherent humility, whether or not it's always recognized and sort of seized upon, if that's a sensible way of putting it, by clergy. There's an inherent, and all sort of ministers in the liturgy, there's an inherent humility to sort of yoking ourselves to a way of praying and being the body of Christ that is ancient and universal. Of course there are differences, but basically we follow a form of prayer, of public sort of communal prayer that is recognizable to Christians throughout the world and throughout time, and we don't make it up. And I think it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, interesting. A beautiful affirmation of the liturgy. I just, when we come back to the story here, I think the part of the story, besides the kind of woe is me Peter reaction, the other part that I like the most is that Jesus is in the boat with us and he says, put out into the deep water. And I think that the last two popes have written about putting out into the deep water, thinking of this in spiritual terms, not just, we're at the shore here. I'm preaching out of your boat, my floating pulpit. Now get out where the fish are, farther out. Which, by the way, is not always true. Oftentimes, fish are along the edge of the water, not always farther out. But anyway, this putting out into deep water, and I think that we can, with our spiritual lives, we can kind of play around in the waters, splash around. But really the hope of our podcast, really, and the way we seek to be as a church here is to put out into deep water, to seek to bring people into the mysterium, the divine mysterium, to meet the divine being, to meet the living Christ, to meet their own humanity, and to meet the culture we live in. And the only way to really do that is to push way off from the shoreline of our culture, and to just say in the shoreline of our busy lives, and to sort of plunge into the depths. So I hear in this just this wonderful call to spiritual depth, and that's where the action happens. And for the disciples with Jesus, it happens off the shoreline, away from the crowd, the pressing crowd. It happens out alone with Jesus.
Yeah, for sure. And in terms of Luke's storytelling, some people comment that this is a sort of sign of, or it's an allusion to, the Pauline Gentile mission.
Oh, right.
And that, they had two boats. And,
the two boats.
Paul, obviously Peter's the one here, but he obviously had to acquiesce to Paul's push to reach the Gentiles too, right? So it's an interesting allusion if that's true, because Luke goes on to write those stories in the book of Acts. So that's sort of interesting too. But yeah, I like the deep water. That's a great image. And also I love Simon's humility, that he's a fisherman. This is his profession. And who's Jesus to come along and tell him how to do it? And he doesn't react that way at all. He's like, well, if you say so, as if to say he's already pretty compelled by Jesus to do what he says. Yeah. And I would think that a lifelong fisherman who's exhausted from a whole night of doing what he does best, right, would be really put out by someone just, try this,
I just, as my being someone named Peter, I really love your shout out to Peter, because he takes such a harsh rap.
He's called Simon here.
Right. Yeah, why is he called Simon here? His apostolic call, but we get such a rap as, one who's difficult. And here he is, saying, yes, if you say so.
I brought in, to show Rob earlier, this First Nations translation of the Bible, or of the New Testament. It's so interesting. And it's just given different names for people. And Peter in there is called the one who hears. And I love that. It's a really kind of compelling translation to just put some context around these people.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Very interesting stuff. I want to go back to the put out into deep water. piece of this. That's the part that really stood out to me when I was reading it, for the same reasons that you named, Peter. I think that is the whole task. When I was trying to explain myself to the powers that be in the ordination process, I say that in all love to the Diocese of Connecticut, obviously. I was ordained and obviously still serve in the Episcopal Diocese of Connecticut. But anyway, you have to explain yourself quite a lot, like, why do you want to do this? And then, 6 months, a year later, and are you sure you still want to do this, and why? And I keep coming back to this quotation from the Jesuit Karl Rahner, which I've probably mentioned in this podcast and in sermons before, but he said that, and this is in the 70s or something, 60s or 70s, that the Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist at all. Right. In a secular age, which we basically live in now, there are some interesting questions and caveats to that, especially these days, but we live in a basically secular age, and religion is not the default. Church attendance and participation, et cetera, is not the default. And people now, and just as the future goes on, I think will increasingly need experience to grab a hold of them. When it's not conventional, when it's not expected, when it's not rewarded socially, they'll need some sort of experience to hook them. And, there's a whole spectrum of religious, or sometimes just like intensely emotional experience that's coded as religious experience. And some of it is not all that helpful or holy, in my opinion. But there is real experience of the divine and of the holy, and of course of Jesus, and I think this has to be what we are seeking to lead people to in the small, sort of humble ways we are called to do so. I think we are still called to do so, and it's a challenging thing, especially if you're sort of like, well, I have no idea what that deep water would be like. I mean, I look at the water and I only see the surface, and I can't imagine what's under the surface. I mean, that's somebody who hasn't had this sort of spiritual experience, who can't even really imagine it, never mind desire it. But if you end up in the deep water, however it happens, even just once, you know that there's this dimension of consciousness, of spiritual experience, of just being alive, that is so rich and full, and renders everything else in our lives sort of full of light. I mean, in the Psalms it says, "In your light we see light," which is a favorite verse for mystics. And anyway, so I think this is especially now so central to the Church's ministry, or at least ought to be.
Yeah, deep water. I mean, it's such a lasting, perennial wisdom image, and I think in the path of Jesus, I mean, he was doing something completely new that hadn't been done before, still kind of hasn't been completed in our world of creating a new humanity, like showing us a new way to be human. And beautiful. The deep water, the mystical experience, it always points towards union, with God, with holiness, with one another. There's no division or sowing of tribalism, and that is a message that our world cannot accept, right? Cannot hear. No generation has mastered this, and movements come along that get it, like the Gandhi movement in India and Martin Luther King's movement that sowed seeds for civil rights change. I mean, these are the nonviolent, active resistors who see that we could all be one. We actually could do it if we could try it. And people get killed for saying that. I mean, that's the thing. Like, Jesus was killed for that. And I think that's the deep water, is staying that course and having the kind of experience, the deep spiritual experience that allows you to feel free to step into that water and not get out and not be afraid of it. Because that's the cost of discipleship. If you talk about Bonhoeffer's time with Gandhi in India, and Martin Luther King's time with Gandhi in India, they all tasted this message. And I think one other powerful thing about this Sunday in the Isaiah passage is that it says, tell this message and no one will be able to hear it no one will be able to see it or understand it. Cities will be laid waste over and over again, but don't stop spreading the message. And it's an incredible juxtaposition with this call to discipleship, because it's still a message we can't hear in our time, but it is deep. You have to have some kind of true inner transformation to realize what Jesus is about and what it will cost us, and yet how it will make us live.
Oh, each of your comments are super beautiful and super true. And I went to the place when I was in India, in New Delhi, where Gandhi was assassinated. It was very, very compelling place. Yes, I mean, you're talking about the unitive way and the non-dualistic approach, and that we all belong. This is the divine. This is the divine being, and that's what we're supposed to be putting people in touch with to the best that we can, because it's the divine being, which is the transformative, unifying, loving element. And the cost of discipleship is more easily paid when one is so compelled that that's the way you are, because you know that is the ultimate reality, and that's the inspiration, that's the alpha and the omega of your life. And so there it is. Yeah. Well, folks, we've wandered off the boat and onto the shore and back out to the boat and jumped off the boat into the depths. And we love it that you join in with our podcast. We are always enriched when you respond in any way, and we love it when you forward our stuff, because ultimately it's about our Lord, and the midrash that we have is the midrash that is happening all over the world and happening in people's minds as we wrestle with and try to understand the living life of Christ in our lives. It's a really incredible thing. Anyway, peace be with you. God bless you, and thank you again. Look forward to chatting with you again on the horizon. Take care. Bye-bye.